The views expressed on the following program do not necessarily reflect the views of Money Radio staff, management, or advertisers, and do not represent an offer to buy or sell any securities. Some interviews heard on this program may be sponsored by the participants. It's time for Health Futures with Cypress Home Care Solutions, Bob Roth. This is Arizona's only show dedicated to providing you with expert advice on how to live a longer, healthier, and happier life. To learn more, call 602-264-8009. That's 602-264-8009. Now, here's your host, Bob Roth.
Good afternoon. You're listening to Health Futures, taking stock in you, and I'm your host, Bob Roth, and it must be Friday, and indeed it is. We're coming at you live from the Scottsdale Money Radio Studios, Scottsdale Air Park. It is Friday, November 12th, and if this is your first time tuning into our show is about how our older adult population can live a healthier, happier life. And how can they do that? They can do that by listening to the show. And it isn't so much about listening to me, your host, it's the guests that I am able to bring to the show. And today is no different. I have an extraordinary guest here in the show, and I also have someone riding shotgun with me, co-hosting here today, Michelle Cornelius, the Chief Operating Officer at Cypress Home Care Solutions. Welcome to the show.
Good to be back. Always enjoy being here.
But our special guest here, and I want to just open it up and just say, it is National Family Caregiver Month. And today, having Kathy Norris-Wilhelm here is really special to both Michelle and I. She's an incredibly special human being, and she is here to share her story as her role as a family caregiver for her late wife, Jean. Kathy, I so appreciate you being here on the show and telling your story and sharing that with us and, more importantly, with our listeners.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's good to have you here on the show. And, I really would like you to really talk about, your journey. Jean was an incredibly special person. And, I am so blessed and so privileged that you called on us to be there to assist you in that journey. And so many people who are these family caregivers, they feel like they are all alone, and they feel like they can't or don't want any assistance. And you did that all alone for a long time. And, you got to the point where you said, I can't just do this by myself.
Absolutely. and it was daunting. When you think about, Jean was exhibiting symptoms of early onset Alzheimer's probably 2 to 3 years before we had a diagnosis. So it's been about 7 years that I've been her care provider. And it just became more and more where I needed the help and I needed to reach out. And the pandemic did not help. I mean, the isolation, we went from having a team of friends and family that could spend time with Jean to being a team of one. And that's when I really had to shoot the flares in the air and waving the white flags and reaching out to get the help. And Cypress was amazing for us.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I think what made, your story is really extraordinary is that, not just the fact that you were a caregiver for someone with Alzheimer's, it's just the love that the two of you guys had for life. And you guys really lived life. I mean, wow. I mean, you got cheated in terms of the years, but the years that you did have were really special.
We did. We were blessed to have 25 years together. And, and being married for 8 years, those vows were very, very important to both of us. And, in sickness and health, and we lived it. We lived it. And I have no doubt that if I had been inflicted with this, Jean absolutely would have done the same thing for me.
And I want our listeners, we don't have a television or pictures. Kathy is a spry young woman. Alzheimer's, there's this stigma that it's an old person's disease. And, Jean was really young when she was diagnosed. And like you said, she displayed symptoms prior to that. She was in her early 50s when she started with the symptoms.
She was.
I think, when we think about family caregiving, you as a spouse, we're in a role many spouses are in, except that it's not as typical to be a younger spouse. However, we often have younger daughters and sons and grandchildren, and we're seeing more and more of the early onset, and so we're seeing more kids. We've had high school kids who are primary for parents as caregivers. And so your caregiving story is not one of caregiving, but became one of advocacy as well.
Absolutely.
When I think about advocacy in the Phoenix area, in the dementia community, it's always your picture, Jean's picture that comes to mind. And down at the Capitol, and really encouraging funding for family caregiving and for more research and everything that can be done so that other families get more support and maybe at some point in time a prevention to this.
I agree.
And I think that's what I admire most about you is that you've been right out in front telling your story and telling the story when Jean was still here with us and you guys were out front and talking about this.
Jean was an educator, and education was very important to our lives. And we did all the research that we could. We also knew that this was the most progressive and aggressive form of her disease. So we also knew that there was the clock was ticking, and we got in busy very quickly. And that was it. To Jean's core, she always was about helping other people. And even when she was diagnosed, right away we jumped in for drug studies, and knowing that she might not benefit, but somebody potentially could. The EPIC program that we were associated with, the Alzheimer's Association, which provided workshops and classes, what to prepare for. We knew the storm was coming, and it helped us prepare for our own day-to-day life and then what the future was going to be, whatever that planning looked like. That was critical. That was always the center of Jean's mission, and our mission together was to always help others.
That's Dr. David Kuhn's program.
So
Yes,
He's been a guest here on our show.
I love David.
When we go back into the beginning of this story for you too, we hear from a lot of people memory loss, but a lot of people who aren't exposed to this think, well, they forget your name or they just forget something.
Right.
Your journey with Jean, because it was a more aggressive form, was a faster story, but you saw some of those same signs and symptoms even being very young. Can you tell us a little bit about that beginning of the story?
Yeah, absolutely. So early on, Jean was affected by language. So, and again, it wasn't like, where did I lose my keys? That came later. It was more, she was forgetting the names of things. She could remember the function of them, but she couldn't say, oh, that's the TV remote. That's the stick. She was starting to rename things. And I remember very vividly one morning, she was getting really frustrated. She was usually, first on campus as a teacher and the last to leave. So she was up very early in the morning, and she was really agitated, and she was throwing all of her shoes out of the closet one morning. And I was like, what are you doing? She couldn't find this one pair of shoes, and she loved shoes, so there was a lot of shoes that were coming out of that closet, and it was right in front of her. So that's another, again, it was right there. Her brain couldn't register her shoe was right there.
Right.
So in hindsight, there were a lot of those incidents of not just memory, it's personality changes. She was by nature very introverted. She became very extroverted.
Wow.
Her tastes in food changed, her palate for foods. She couldn't eat spicy food anymore. It was like, oh no, that's too hot.
I've had lifelong vegetarians suddenly want a hamburger.
Yeah. It's crazy. So it's behavior changes. And so, forgetting her PIN number for her bank card, or we'd get an invoice for our credit card. Well, what's this? Literally not know what something is. And then the repeated questions as well. That was really, that came very soon. She asked me 4 times one night, honey, did we feed the dogs? And after the 4th time, I looked at him, are you serious? She had been the one to feed them that night. And again, red flag. So her day-to-day lives were being interrupted with these hiccups, as she started to call them. But they were huge. Because they just were mounting.
So a lot of people then go to a doctor with that type of thing, and the doctor says, well, it could be aging. Let's wait 6 months and come back and see what's going on.
That's what they did. And because of her age, that's what happened. She was originally diagnosed with anxiety. So she was put on Zoloft, which did help with her anxiety. Then it was mild cognitive impairment. No one wanted to give that diagnosis, not even her neurologist when we went to our neurologist, because she was so young.
Right.
And we started with, she has a family history of aneurysms. She suffered from migraines her entire life. So we started in the process of ruling those things out. Is it a brain tumor? Is it an aneurysm? But no one was looking for it.
Well, as you can hear, the music's on, so we're down one segment, but I want to hear more about this, Kathy, because
Sure.
I mean, because she was so young, and there's so many out there right now that are having some of these difficulties that Jean was having, and we need to treat those seriously. Those are warning signs.
Absolutely.
We'll talk a little bit more in the second segment. You're listening to Health Futures, Taking Stock in You. My name is Bob Roth. I'm your host, and co-hosting today is Michelle Cornelius, our Chief Operating Officer at Cypress Home Care Solutions. And we have Kathy Norris-Wilhelm here in the studio with us talking about being a family caregiver. Stick around. We'll be right back.
Now back to Health Futures, taking stock in you. If you have questions about your own or your loved one's future health care, call 602-264-8009. Now, here's your host, Cypress Home Care Solutions, Bob Roth.
Welcome back. You're listening to Health Futures, Taking Stock in You. I'm your host, Bob Roth. And if you're just tuning in, we're in our second segment. We're actually talking about National Family Caregiving Month, and I'm pleased to have Michelle Cornelius, our Chief Operating Officer at Cypress Home Care Solutions, here along with me. And my guest here today is Kathy Norris-Wilhelm, and she's here to talk about her experience as a family caregiver and really talk about the love of her life partner, and her wife, Jean, who she just recently lost, and this journey that she went through. And when we ended our first segment, we started talking about some of the early signs and what that meant to her. And certainly, you know, I think you referred to them as blockages, where she just couldn't come up with the name or couldn't find the place or the right words. Those were some of the early telltale signs. And for our listeners too, you know, Jean was very young when she got diagnosed. She was in her mid or early 50s, and she just passed this past May, I think it was. March. So, I mean, you know, she is one of those people that had early onset, and there are very many that do. And I want to pick up on some of those early signs, and some of the things that you talked about at the break is, you know, the costs that go into this, and people just don't have any clue what this is all about. And you knew something was wrong.
Yeah.
You just needed to figure out how to get to the bottom of it. And a diagnosis of dementia or Alzheimer's wasn't one of those things that doctors were looking for.
Not at all. Not at all. We needed answers. And Jean was so brave, everything in her life. She was a natural leader. She was very courageous, and she was not going to run away from this. And so we jumped in, and we just were persistent in getting answers. And, you know, we were in the prime of our life and our income earning years, never dreaming that we would be hit with this tsunami of a diagnosis of dementia and the cost that would be associated with it. And even with the insurance that we had, it took our persistence of pushing through and not being satisfied with, oh, it's just anxiety or it's mild cognitive impairment. What's causing it? And so we were persistent, and she was persistent. So she, in the winter of 2015, she underwent a neuropsych evaluation, which was a 5-hour cognitive test that cost out of pocket $1,800 that we had to pay.
Insurance would not pick that up.
No.
Primarily because there wasn't a definitive diagnosis.
Right.
Probably. Yeah.
Exactly.
You were still trying to get to the bottom of this.
Exactly.
And for our listeners, I mean, you know, Jean was an educator.
Oh, she was brilliant.
She was in the Chandler School System.
The other thing, she, you know, here's a double master degree, PhD, who's forgetting how to operate her computer. What's wrong? I mean, that's clearly indicative. This is a brilliant person that is struggling at basic daily functions. So we were just not going to give up until we found what was causing this.
And I think that's an important point there, Kathy, that when you say they're looking at and they're trying to diagnose, well, maybe there's a mild cognitive impairment versus a dementia. Dementia, by definition, impairs your daily living. If you have an impairment, it's not mild cognitive impairment. So I want our listeners to know, if you're getting that, be the warrior that Jean was and pursue this.
Yes, I agree. Thank you, Michelle. Absolutely. And, you know, it was just so frustrating because she wasn't getting better, and she was unlearning, of course, as we found out, so quickly, all the things that we all take for granted. She was unlearning that at a very rapid rate.
Right. Yeah. And so she was working at the time. She had to retire, take an early retirement.
You know, and I've had many meetings also with Chandler Unified, which is a school district that she taught in education. This is a teachable moment for everyone.
Right.
If you have someone, she was such an advocate in education. She was calling on our legislators for public funding for years. She was so involved on different committees for the school district. Everyone knew who she was. And yet, in her last year of teaching, she missed more work calling in because she was struggling. And I thought, instead of looking at that as a disciplinary, like what's going on, why aren't you in the classroom, what's happening, and having that compassion even for the teachers,
right,
in your job, what's going wrong.
And I think that we see that both from the person who is potentially struggling and needs a diagnosis, and I hear that from family care partners a lot too. I've suddenly have to start taking a lot of time off of work because now you have to go to every single doctor's appointment.
Absolutely.
You have to be the memory for that appointment. You have to be the decision maker. If Jean isn't occupied with somebody, you need to be there with her.
Yes. Yeah.
So care partners are taking a lot more time off of work too, and I agree. It's an education moment for all employers.
Everybody, yes, everyone. And you know, we used to call it the name game. I was filling in. I didn't even realize how many times I was filling in for her, and she was so good at masking as well. Because again, she had this brilliant reserve.
right.
But even in her final, when she was really advanced, we have very good friends that they never realized how far advanced her disease was because she was so good at masking.
So you did go about finally getting a diagnosis. How did your friends and family respond?
Well, it's interesting, Michelle, because I often equate it. We were sort of in this bubble when we knew something was wrong, so we were sort of isolated. I also equated it sort of like coming out as an LGBT member. It was almost like coming out again. Who do we tell? Who do we trust? Is it safe?
Right.
You know, and in dementia, people don't talk about it, and people
Especially
are scared.
young.
Yes,
Especially young,
absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely. So that was a slow process as well, but I think people were in denial about it. They just couldn't believe it. But Jean, ever the warrior, she wanted to use this as a teachable moment, and that's why we decided very early on we were going to share our story to help other people.
And you built up quite a support community within the dementia community too. Because of your advocacy, because of the work you were doing, and because you're very public about all of that. And public about, you were also very open about her disease progression.
Yes.
And really allowed people into your lives to see, to witness what you were experiencing.
It was very important, and it still is, and that'll be part of her legacy as well. I will never stop, and her story, just like I said, love never dies. Our love story is not over. It will continue just like our advocacy, absolutely.
I think that's what I love about you. I really do, because it hasn't ended. And you know, I had the pleasure of sharing a little special moment on ABC 15 this week, and really talking about National Family Caregiving. And you got a chance to tell your story, and more people need to hear this story. I think where I want to get to before we end this second segment is really, when did you get to the point where you said, I need some help? When did that occur to you, when you really couldn't, and especially during the pandemic, which made it really hard because there weren't a whole lot of people you were going to let into your bubble where you needed help? No,
and I didn't realize just how much I had been shouldering. But even before the pandemic, I had reached out because I knew physically I had gone through two bouts of shingles.
2 bouts. Wow.
And just my own physical health and mental health was declining because I was the sole care provider. And I did reach out, our association with the Alzheimer's Association, and we were fortunate because we had that community. I had resources to say, now's the time. And I trust the people that I worked very closely with. And I reached out, we did a home assessment. And unfortunately, initially, Jean, I referred to as a bucking bronco. She wanted no part of it. It was me or no one. And it was baby steps of just trying to, even the comfort care, the companion care to come in to give me breaks with me there. She was still very, 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 very resistant. Yeah. So
she really was, and we spent a lot of time like coming up with solutions and
Your team is amazing.
Let's try this plan. But I think that that's an important thing for families to hear. You don't come in and find success, your definition of success the first time around.
No.
So far, your whole story has been we keep pushing, we keep trying.
Yes,
And
we did.
the same is with support from family and friends and professionals in the home. You keep changing things up, keep trying.
Yes.
Success will come in some form.
And it was a team. I mean, that
Yeah.
was Jean's teaching style as well. When she was a teacher, it took the parents' involvement and her in the classroom very much the same. We were doing our routine and keeping Jean safe and functioning, but it required a team. And we had an amazing team that was working behind the scenes to make it successful for Jean and for me.
You know, one of the things that you said, and, you know, we're getting ready to close our second segment here, is that so many people forget about the patient and what they're going through. And, you know, Jean was a brilliant person with a PhD and, you know, degrees, you know, several degrees, as well as being an educator. She knew what was going on.
She did.
And like you said, she was able to mask it. And Michelle, we see so many people today that have early onset or have, you know, dementia symptoms, and they're masking it every day to their loved ones.
Absolutely. And the smarter you are, the more you can mask. Like you said earlier, you have that reserve. Really draw from.
Well, we got a little Paul McCartney taking us out here. We got Wings. We're at halftime here at Health Futures, and we're talking National Family Caregiving, and I'm so pleased to have Kathy Norris-Wilhelm here talking about her journey. So please stick around. We got 2 more segments, and we're going to talk a little bit more about her journey and National Family Caregiving Month. We'll be right back.
Being in control of your money provides freedom. Learn how to make it, spend it, and invest it. We're Money Radio 1510 and 105.3 FM.
Now back to Health Futures, taking stock in you. If you have questions about your own or your loved one's future health care, call 602-264-8009. Now, here's your host, Cypress Home Care Solutions, Bob Roth.
Welcome back. You're listening to Health Futures Taking Stock in You. If you're just tuning in, we're in our second segment here, and we are talking National Family Caregiver Month, and I'm really pleased to have here riding shotgun with me, Michelle Cornelius. She's our Chief Operating Officer at Cypress Home Care Solutions, but I truly am honored to have Kathy Norris-Wilhelm here in the studio with me. She's not only a family caregiver, but she is a loved one that went through the struggles of early onset Alzheimer's, and she's been telling her story. You can catch it up on our website, but I want to jump right back into this. Kathy, you had your circle of friends really helping you. You shared with us in the first 2 segments that journey that you went through, just trying to get a diagnosis and all the costs that went along with it and all the anguish and anxieties that you were feeling. And then once you found out what you were dealing with, what was that like? What did that feeling feel like when you got that diagnosis, what you were dealing with?
It was bittersweet. We'd been living in limbo for so long. And just pushing to get a diagnosis for what was causing it. And then when we got it, of course, it was this devastating, wow. I mean, what I will never forget walking out of our neurologist's office, just feeling like my legs were logs and my feet were cinder blocks. We just didn't really, I personally didn't know where we were going to go with this. I mean, I knew Jean was my co-pilot and we were going to live in the next phase of this with grace and dignity, and we were determined to do just that. And we were determined to keep living. We weren't going to let this diagnosis really keep us down, and from the way that we lived, which was full of joy and love and laughter, and that's what we did.
When we ended the second segment, I talked about the person that does get that diagnosis, or at least is going through it and masking it to everybody and trying to hide it.
Jean didn't. She and I. It seems crazy to say that she embraced this diagnosis, but she really did. She accepted it. She knew that this was what was happening. She was relieved to have an answer, because she was living and trying to function every day and really so bravely and courageously. But no, she didn't. She never was in a state of denial. And the way Jean lived was ever a victor, never a victim, and pity was never an option for her. And she was determined to live more fully and to share our story and to move forward.
So for our listeners, she understood the diagnosis.
Absolutely.
She knew what she was going through.
Yeah, recently I had a friend of mine shared a conversation that she had with Jean, and she said, you do know that I have Alzheimer's, don't you? So she did. I mean, even in those conversations. And I will also share with you, this is very telling on the way that Jean lived. She was interviewed very early on by one of our stories that we were sharing, and the reporter asked her, what's it like suffering with Alzheimer's? And she immediately stopped him, and she's like, I'm not suffering. I'm living with Alzheimer's. That's the difference.
I applaud her. Absolutely. I push
I
that
got chills.
all of the time. People only suffer if we make them suffer.
Right.
And we
Suffering's
do that by not having the support that we need. And you said she did it with dignity and grace. I know you have team dignity and grace.
I love that.
This is still you get team dignity and grace when you're doing the Alzheimer's walks and everything. That's your team name.
Yep.
And you really did form a group of, like you say, chosen family who supported you through this. And even with all of that support, you did get to a point where it was too much. And it was during COVID.
Right. Right. I can't imagine. I mean, I know people that don't have the support that we have. I you know, when people say, I can't imagine what you're going through, and I tell them, you really should, because caregiving is going to affect you at some point in your life, whether you are giving care or you know someone that needs care, or potentially we all have brains, so we all are at risk for developing dementia as well.
Right.
But that empathy of what we're going through, and you know, I think that's the importance too of sharing our story, is there's people and families out there. You're not alone. And the more that we can help people get tied in to get the support and the help that they need in whatever capacity.
And I think there are a lot of people who don't know what to do when they hear that a family or friend has any type of diagnosis, whether it be a dementia or cancer or something. And they say, oh my goodness, if you need anything, let me know. What I find from the primary caregiver is that at that time, they don't need anything. We're just figuring it out. We're okay. What happens is things slowly get piled on you, and there's eventually that straw that breaks the camel's back. Unfortunately, sometimes that puts the care partner into the hospital or gets them sick. Or if it's a person with a memory impairment, they don't remember that help was ever offered, and they don't recognize they need help. What are some ways that people can support family members without just that general, let me know what you need?
I think I think the benefit of embracing this diagnosis and getting involved and getting as much information and educating yourselves, there's power in knowledge, and you need all of that. We were able to participate in a lot of these classes that prepared us for it. We knew the storm was coming, and they helped provide us with those things. So tips for keeping a honey-do list. As things were coming up, when people would ask, how can we help you? Then I could say, oh, look, I need help with the yard, or can you go to the grocery store? I started keeping a list of things and ways that people could help us.
And I think that's what's important. You have that list, and it doesn't have to be, I need my weeds pulled. I need to get to the grocery store sometime by the end of the week and pick this up. And if you're going, can you get it for me? Yeah. So it is your typical honey-do list. You're not making this for other people, but when they ask, give them an item off that off your list to accomplish.
Yes.
And I know Bob has said, and I say all the time, if you're making a casserole or a lasagna, make two and just deliver one. Yes. If you know your neighbor is struggling on trash night, make sure their cans are down to the curb.
Yes.
You don't have to necessarily do a lot. The little things make a huge difference.
The little things aren't little.
Right.
They are. All of them are huge, especially when you're carrying the world on your shoulders.
The other thing that I tell folks all of the time is when you call a caregiver and ask, how are you doing? You always get the other person's story first. Well, she is this, and this, and ask again, and how are you doing?
Right.
That phone conversation just to check in can be huge.
It's critical. It's a lifeline.
Because you were very isolated during COVID.
Absolutely.
You were home, and like you said, you were a team of one for a while.
Yeah, and I honestly, I just want to mention this. I am an exception as well. My employer was above and beyond. He's a very generous man. His mother also had Alzheimer's. He was very well versed on what the disease was doing. He actually created a safe work environment, not only for myself, but I was able to bring Jean with me when she was no longer able to be alone.
Oh, wow.
And he created projects, he engaged, keeping her stimulated. And he actually thought, he admitted this, when COVID hit and we all were working from home, but I would always say I'm home trying to work, because suddenly my caregiving became even more overwhelming, because I was everything. And if whatever her needs were, if they weren't met, I could no longer really work. I mean, my full-time job became caregiving 24/7. And even my employer, he was amazed, because he thought he was helping me. Oh, you can go home now, and Jean can be home. And it just really created a tsunami. And it really, then the caregiving just became even more overwhelming.
Yeah. And you never step away from your job when you're working from home, and you never step away from your job as a care partner when you're with them 24/7.
Right.
So you're trying to do two jobs at the same time.
Two jobs at the same time and getting very little, if any, sleep. And you must have been just
So sleep deprived.
Yeah.
And overwhelmed.
And think about what that does to people's health. Both, physical and emotional health is just unbelievable. And you're not alone. I mean, people are listening right now that are going through very similar things. And that's what I want to pick up on this last segment.
Great.
You're listening to Health Futures Taking Stock in You. I'm your host, Bob Roth. I've got Michelle Cornelius. She is our Chief Operating Officer at Cypress Home Care Solutions, assisting me with this extraordinary interview with Kathy Wilhelm, or Norris-Wilhelm, and we're talking about National Family Caregiving Month. We got one more segment. We'll be right back.
Now back to Health Futures, taking stock in you. If you have questions about your own or your loved one's future health care, call 602-264-8009. Now, here's your host, Cypress Home Care Solutions, Bob Roth.
Welcome back. You're listening to Health Futures Taking Stock in You. I'm your host, Bob Roth, and we are on our fourth segment here. I have got Kathy Norris-Wilhelm here in the studio with me. She is a family caregiver, and we are talking about National Family Caregiving Month. And I've got Michelle Cornelius helping me with this interview, because Michelle and Kathy have developed a relationship in terms of really figuring out how to care for a loved one who has early onset dementia and Alzheimer's. And the two of you guys worked very nicely together through this journey that Jean was going through. So when we left off on the third segment, you had talked about how, the needs of Jean continued to increase, and at the same time your sleep was decreasing, and really wanted you to pick up on that and really, how were you able to do this? Because it is incredible. You were working, you were a care partner, and you were getting no sleep.
Yeah. And each day more and more was just piling onto my shoulders of that responsibility. I would reference to, so many people in my life were telling me the importance of self-care and taking care of myself, and the oxygen mask, it drops down. You have to take oxygen for yourself before you can help another person.
So true.
And that's what I was desperately trying to do. But each day, especially during the pandemic, it was just so isolating to have all of that responsibility on my shoulders. I literally couldn't breathe. I was reaching a point where I was suffocating physically, emotionally, and mentally with doing everything. And, since Jean's passed, I've had people ask me, how did you do it? And my answer is always, I don't know. But I can tell you this, at the core of it all was love.
Right.
Our love and devotion to one another. And that is literally what sustained me to help keep her safe and provide the best care that I could.
So we keep talking about Jean, and I never did get a chance to meet her. Michelle did.
I wish you had.
I wish I had too.
She's wonderful.
But I do want you to just take a moment and really share with us how you guys met, and your story, because it's an incredible story.
It's
Absolutely.
fun. We had a lot of love and laughter in our lives. She moved here from California in '93 to pursue her degree in education. She knew she wanted to be a math teacher. and we met in 96, and we were blessed with 25 years of so much fun and laughter, and we lived large. We had lots of silliness, and you know, even when she was diagnosed, we've said this so many times, joy was at the center of everything that we did together. And we were just playmates. We had so much fun and silliness, and no, that is one of the things that it was just also a grieving the loss of, as her disease progressed.
Right.
The laughter was less and less and less. And I will share this. I've just recently had some of our home videos transferred, and it's wonderful because now I get to see the love of my life living large. It's not sad. It's
Right.
truly like being reunited and reminiscing has just been, I'm so grateful for those memories.
And you're able to find some of that now? I mean, 8 months later, you know, some of the laughter, just seeing some of that?
I'm in the early stages. I'm healing from so much. The
Sure.
trauma of what we've been through, the loss, but yeah.
And you're getting sleep now.
I am. Yes,
And-
finally.
And what a difference that must make for you.
It absolutely does.
The clarity, the mental clarity.
Yeah, no brain fog. It's definitely, I'm out, I hike, I spend a lot of times. Jean and I were very, very active, and we spent a lot of times in the parks and being outdoors, and that's where I feel close to her. I know she's
Nice.
always with me, and so yeah, that's very important.
Nice.
Every time I'm hiking and I see a dragonfly, I think of her.
Oh, I know.
Every
Me
time I'm
too.
out.
I passed a dragonfly, flew over me in the car on the way here, so I know she's always around me. Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
You know, you are incredible in sharing your story, and so many are listening in and probably living very similar stories. What kind of messages would you like to really share with them to really help them in that journey? Because, you know, you got to the other side, and unfortunately it did mean a loss. But I will tell you, Kathy, I mean, I know you're still crushed inside, but the exterior of you looks very healthy. And
Well, thank you. You know, Jean had moments of clarity, and I will never forget. We were sitting on the couch one night, and she looked at me because she knew we were in it. I mean, we knew we couldn't win it, but we were in it together. And she looked at me and she said, you know, no matter what you do, it's not going to change the outcome. And that was very enlightening.
Wow.
It was like, because
But
we were doing everything.
And you felt like you could fix it, right?
Yeah, I was so, my intent was to keep her, the quality of her life, and to extract as much joy as we could while we could. That was it. And love was at the core of it. But I just want to say, don't give up hope. Every day there is something to find joy and love, to love, whether it's outside listening to the birds and being centered and staying present. There's so much to live for. There's so much to have hope for. I admit, I mean, there were times I couldn't see the light at the end of the tunnel. I really couldn't. But I persevered. And I know that when you focus on the love and support and everything around you, there's always hope. There's always hope.
And even when Jean was actively passing, you would send me pictures of holding her hand and sitting with her, and you were still finding that connection and the love even when she was non-responsive.
Yes.
And right up until the very end, there was no doubt your love for her.
Yeah. The hospice nurses had
Absolutely.
said, they'd come into our room and they were like, you get it.
Yeah.
We created a loving, for her transition, she was still surrounded by so much love. And friends that were with us said, you know, I also helped them change the face of what death looks like when people are leaving this physical world, and still to have that love and touching and talking, and she's there. And, you know, she was in her life review and we would joke, did she have to accomplish so much? Because she was, you know, taking so long. But it was at the core of it was love.
Absolutely.
It was just love, and that what sustained us through it.
And during the break, we were talking about her celebration of life afterwards. She was celebrated,
Yeah.
and she continues to be celebrated, not only in interviews like this, but in the advocacy work that you continue to do. We know that her legacy is going to go on a long time. And other advocates are advocating because of the advocacy that you do. So even though Jean may not be here actively doing it, you continue, you're encouraging other people. You've got a team behind you.
Absolutely. And I've said that countless times to people, by sharing your story, you have no idea the impact that has. And I talk about Jean at the coffee shop. I talk about the Alzheimer's walk last week. 5 or 10 minutes, you're changing someone's perspective and perception of what that looks like. and inspiring other people to share their story. Everybody has a short.
And when
Everybody
we
has a
talk
story to
about,
share.
you talk about advocating to the legislature, that's the most important thing. You may not know what dollars to ask for. You may not know what bills are being passed, but share your story.
That personal-
because your story makes a difference.
Yeah.
Oh, it totally makes a difference. And, you know, the courage you have to come out and share that story. It's not easy. It really isn't. But, I mean, that's the legacy that lives inside of you with Jean, is to continue to tell that story so you can help others.
Yeah.
And I give you so much credit for, you know, not only telling your story, but how you guys approach this. I mean, and I think the approach is so important. And you wanted to get to the bottom of what was going on. And I think the message to our listeners is, if something doesn't seem right, find out what's going on.
Please do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go see your PCP. And if you don't have a definitive diagnosis, don't stop there. Keep going.
I can't tell you how many people, had we really isolated ourselves even more after this diagnosis, by going public, countless people. We've inspired people to also get tested themselves.
Love
you
it.
know, I've noticed the signs, but, you know, you did it, and so I had the courage to do it as well. So, yes.
You know, Bob, as we hear the music coming on, Jean was always a Friday dancer.
Yes, Dancing Fridays.
Dancing Fridays.
Dancing Fridays, all right. Woohoo!
Dance us.
we should have asked Josh to put on more of maybe an ABBA tune, right? But needless to say, you know, Kathy Norris-Wilhelm, thank you so
Thank you,
much for
Bob.
the
Thank you,
courage
Michelle.
and our friendship and the ability to come out and talk about this. And for you, our listener who is a family caregiver, there are resources out there, plenty of them. If you're not sure where they are, feel free to call us at Cypress Home Care Solutions at 602-264-8009. Make it a great day. Have a great weekend. And thank you again, Kathy.
Thank you, Bob.
Thanks,
Thank you, Michelle.
Kathy.
There's no place like home. You've been listening to Bob Roth's Health Futures. If you have questions about your own or your loved one's future health care, call Cypress Home Care Solutions at 602-264-8009. That's 602-264-8009. Or visit cypresshomecare.com. Be sure to join Health Futures with Bob Roth every Friday at noon, right here on Money Radio 1510 and 105.3 FM.